And that is something that we were really interested in doing throughout the research. How can we make sure that it's very solutions oriented, and that if you're a supply chain professional, you can tomorrow start taking actions. So we did outline in the white paper those 9 areas that supply chain professionals can focus on. 5 of them, and they'll be on the screen in a second, 5 of them are things that supply chain professionals can do themselves. And there are things like how the teams are organized, how they can engage with suppliers, how the data system needs to be developed in order to, for example, take into account those reverse flows. I won't go into all of them because there's a lot, but the last 4 are the things that supply chain professionals need to collaborate with other functions in order to address. And those are things like policymaking, for example, engaging with your public affairs department in order to try to influence legislation that can be supportive of a circular supply chain. Or there are things like product design, and that's a great example. And by the way, as Deborah said, the white paper is full of examples of how companies are already taking action. But on the business model and product design, there's an example on the white paper on how Philips, for example, tried to develop a rental model for one of their devices, and it's called Lumea, and they put it out at first, but then when they came back to when the reverse logistics team were dealing with the items that were being returned within that model, they realized that a lot of them were not designed for refurbishment. So it was that insight loop within the organization where the supply chain team had to give feedback to the product design team, and it's what Douglas was talking about, the kind of combining the design chain and the supply chain to make sure that the circular business model can go ahead and work efficiently.
So, Deborah, what if a supply chain professional is wondering, how do I talk to my team about this? Like, let's say we convinced the audience, they are now like ready to find out more about this. How can they talk to their teams in a way that maybe resonates with them?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of ideas. First, think about this as an innovation tool. I would stress to not use circularity as the goal. Instead, use it as a path to get to what you already need to deliver on this year. So very likely that has to do with cost. We always have to find some money somewhere in our operations, and with lead time. And so if we think about fundamentally changing the way that we do supply chain and imagine that we start with a finished good instead of with a raw material, and if we don't start from the planet every single time and have to go through all of our up supply chain tiers, we can actually go faster and we can actually be cheaper. Now, this does require the right infrastructure, the right partners, but it is possible to do, and there are some brands who are figuring this out. If you have purchased a refurbished electronic recently, for example, the margins on that are pretty great. So we see this shift happening for supply chain teams. So imagine the circularity as a tool set, not as a goal. Try to lean into some storytelling. There's some really nice frameworks and examples and already made decks at the Ellen MacArthur website. And February 7th, there is an intro to the circular economy for supply chain professionals hosted by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So get the basics in place, make sure that you understand it together, or you can just dive in together and say, look, these are the 3 principles. Here's a white paper. Let's go through the definition together and figure out what does this mean for our supply chain, and ask yourselves questions in the format of how might we. Don't try to list all the reasons why it's never going to work. We are very good at doing that. But imagine instead, how might we XYZ? How might we repair more than we build new? How might we have a distributed set of partners instead of globally centralized? And start to imagine and challenge each other, have a little debate, and you'll grasp the concepts quite quickly by getting your hands into it.
Part of that unlearning, part of that change management is to be realistic about keeping the focus, not necessarily on the means to the end, like, let's go do circular, but rather what are the results that can be achieved by introducing that conceptually into what you do every day. So I think that results orientation is also very critical. It's also one of the reasons that we added a lot of those results-oriented sustainability metrics into the SCORE model in addition to OE13. So just wanted to sort of reinforce that. So we're a very customer centric organization. So we have to listen to what these needs are. And part of those means that the basic education is necessary across the organization, which is why we introduced our 2-day course, Building a Sustainable Supply Chain, because let's not assume, I mean, the four of us live in the world every day, right? But let's not assume that people in the supply chain, depending on the role in which they have, or the critical, what I call supply chain adjacent support organizations, people like finance, for example, they need to understand these concepts as well. So I think, part of the change management is to be realistic about the acceptance of that change in the organization, what education, training, upskilling needs to get done. Don't limit yourself to people in supply chain. Remember, supply chain impacts a lot of different functional aspects. And so education for supply chain adjacents is also critically important. And then maybe also to just reinforce the messaging is celebrate the successes, publicize them, make sure that the organization takes advantage of the good work that's done. If we create success in isolation, it's not going to assist our change management efforts. So I think that's also critically important.